Hi, welcome to the video Spring Boot OTP one-time password email example with me, Nam Amin from CodeJava.net. Through this video, I will guide you how to tighten and improve security of an existing Spring Boot application by implementing the one-time password email function with the following strategies. The application will send an email containing a one-time password OTP to the user upon suspicious login, and the OTP is the random string with 8-character length. The OTP will expire after 5 minutes, and the user must use the provided OTP to log in instead of the normal password, and no new technology is required, so it's easy to implement one-time password function. Let me show you a typical scenario in which an OTP is required when a customer or user attempts to log in using the login page like this, and somehow if the application detects that the request is suspicious, it will display an error message like this. For security reason, we will send an on-time password OTP to the email. Kindly check the email and use the provided OTP to log in, and note the OTP will expire after 5 minutes. And this is the content of the email that will be sent to the customer with the subject: here's the one-time password OTP expire in 5 minutes. And in the content of the email, a random password, one-time password is generated, and the customer must use this one-time password in order to log in. Let me explain the OTP process by this diagram. First, when a user attempts to log in by entering email and password in the login page, and before the authentication process on attempt authentication, the application will detect if the request is suspicious or not. And to detect a request is suspicious or spam or not, you can use the Google reCAPTCHA API, and I recommend you to go to my YouTube channel, and you can go to the playlist, this playlist Google reCAPTCHA integration here, and you should follow the Google reCAPTCHA version 3, the Google reCAPTCHA version 3 API. We return a score number to indicate that a request is likely a human or likely a bot. So depending on the return score from the Google reCAPTCHA API, the application can decide if a request is suspicious or not. And in case the request is normal, the application will process the login, the authentication as normal. Otherwise, if a request is likely a spam request, the application will generate one-time password and send an email to the user's email, and then direct the user to the login page, saying that the user must check his email and use the provided OTP in order to log in for security reason. And this diagram explains how to process OTP during the authentication process. The application will check if OTP is required or not. If OTP is not required, it will process the authentication using a normal password. Else, if OTP is required, it will set the password to the one-time password generated in the previous step, and then upon successful login, the application will clear the OTP. So we will be working on an existing Java Spring Boot project based on this technologies: Spring Boot for web application, Spring Data JPA and Hibernate for the data access layer, Spring Security for authentication, Spring Mail for sending email that contains one-time password, Thymeleaf as template engine, HTML5 and Bootstrap for responsive user interface, and MySQL database. And I'm using the following software programs: Java Development Kit JDK, Spring Tools 3 IDE, STS, MySQL Community Server and MySQL Workbench. Now, let me show you an existing Java Spring Boot application on my computer in Spring 2 SUI IDE here. Let me start this Spring Boot application to demo the login function. And as you can see in this Spring application configuration file, it is configured to be running on an embedded Tomcat server listening on port 80 with the context path is /shopme and MySQL database is shopme-db. Okay, the application is up and running as you can see in the console view. The Tomcat started on port 80 with context path /shopme, and let me use Chrome browser to access the application. Localhost /shopme here, and this is the home page of the application. And as the customer, I can log in and I enter my email and log in with the correct email and password. Okay, you see I have successfully logged into the application, and this is my customer details, and log out. And in the next few minutes I will show you how to implement the one-time password OTP email functionality for this Spring Boot application. And here are the key tasks which we need to perform in order to implement the OTP email function. We need to update database table and entity class, adding new column to store on-time password, and we need to write code to generate OTP, write code to send email that contains the one-time password sent to the user, and update the login page, and need to code a before authentication filter in order to detect if a request is searched or not, and we need to code the login success handler and code the login failure handler, and write code to clear the OTP upon successful authentication in case OTP is required. This is MySQL Workbench, and I connected to a local instance of MySQL community server, and this is a database which is used by this Spring Boot application, the shopme-db, and this is a table customers that stores the information about customers. Yeah, and let me select all rows from this customers table, and you can see this is the information about the customers, and you can see the password is encrypted in bcrypt format, as you can see in the project in the Spring security configuration class. Here we use a bcrypt password encoder to encrypt the password. And now in order to implement the one-time password OTP function, we need to add two new columns into this table. So we enter this table. The first new column is to store the one-time password. So the column name is one_time_password, and it data type is varchar, with the length is 64 characters, because 64 is the length of the password encrypted in bcrypt, as you can see in the password. Sorry, varchar 64. As you can see in this table is a password field with data type varchar64 here. So one-time password must have the same type. And the second new column is to store the date and time at which the one-time password is generated. So we name this column as OTP underscore requested underscore time. And the data type is date time. Date time here. Okay, click apply to execute the SQL script to add 2 new columns. Okay, and refresh the select statement, and you can see the 2 new columns appended to the end of the column list here, one-time password and OTP requested time here. And in the project code, we need to update the entity class customer accordingly. So in this project, I have the customer entity class here. And we need to declare 2 new fields in this entity class. Yeah, private string one-time password and date OTP requested time, and specify the column annotation to specify the name of the column in database is one_time_password. And for the field OTP requested time here, OTP underscore requested underscore time. And then we also need to generate getters and setters for those new fields. Here, generate. Okay. So we have done updating the database table users and the corresponding entity class customer. Next, in order to implement OTP, we need to intervene the authentication process of Spring Security. So we need to code an before authentication filter, login success handler, and login failure handler. Okay, let's create a new class for before authentication filter here. Before authentication filter. This filter will be executed before the authentication process takes place. It's better to stop the application because we are going to write a lot of code, make a lot of changes to the project. And we have this class extends the username and password authentication filter, and annotate the class using the component annotation. So Spring framework, we be able to inject an instance of this class, and then we need to override several methods. Here we need to override attempt authentication set authentication manager, set authentication success handler, set authentication failure handler. Okay. And you can see the attempt authentication callback method will be invoked by Spring Security just before the authentication process. So we will write code to detect if a request is suspicious or not in this method. Okay, and in the Spring Security configuration file here, we need to write some code to configure this before authentication filter. But before that, we also need to create an authentication failure handler and authentication success handler, which are needed by this authentication filter. So new class login success handler. And having this class extend the class simple URL authentication success handler here. Finish. And also annotate this class using component annotation and override the method one method on authentication success method here. This callback method will be invoked by Spring Security upon successful login. And then we'll also need to create another class for failure handler. Login failure handler. And have this class extend the simple URL authentication failure handler here. And annotate using component annotation. And override a callback method on authentication failure here. This callback method will be invoked by Spring Security upon failed login. And for initial testing purpose, we just print a statement here in callback method to make sure that the callback method is invoked on authentication failure and on authentication success. And on attempt authentication here, this method will be invoked just before the authentication process. When we should have a less Spring Framework to inject instances for the classes authentication manager, authentication success handler, authentication failure handler. So we use the auto while annotation here before each method. Okay, so the authentication success handler will be resolved to this login success handler. And the authentication failure handler set a method here. We use the class login failure handler. And for the authentication manager here, we need to declare a bin in the Spring Security configuration file. We need to override a method from the superclass authentication manager bin here. And it in the method it just simply returns an authentication manager bin by default, and we need to specify the name of the bin here. Bin IDs authentication manager. So Spring Framework will be able to create an instance of authentication manager and inject into this before authentication filter. Okay, and we need to write constructor for this class to configure this filter to intercept only the login URL. Source generate constructor. Okay, and in this constructor, we call super set username parameter is different than the default because in the login page we use email instead of username. As you can see here, we use email here as the name of the field or represent username, so we need to specify the name of the username parameter here. And note that when we use an authentication filter like this, all the configuration we made for the form login here, username parameter default set URL will be ignored by Spring Security. And in the constructor of the before authentication filter, we need to set requires authentication request matcher to tell Spring Framework we use this filter only for the login URL, new and path request matcher here for this URL / login, and with the HTTP method is post here because we use / login as a login processing URL. Okay, and in the Spring Security configuration file, we need to have declare a reference to before authentication filter here. Before authentication filter, and let Spring Framework to inject an instance of this class automatically. And then we need to specify the filter here. Add from login. After from login, add before from login here. Add filter before, and the filter is before authentication filter, and the filter class before authentication filter dot class. That's it for the configuration of an authentication filter that we intercept the authentication process. Okay, save all the changes, and we start the application to test the authentication filter, login success handler, and login failure handler. Okay, the application is up and running without any error. So far so good. Okay, go to the home page, click login, and let me try to log in. Clear the console first. And now let me enter a wrong password. We got an error. And you can see in the console view it prints attempt authentication. That means the before authentication filter callback method attempt authentication was actually invoked. And then because I entered a wrong password and the login failure handler was executed on this callback method on authentication failure here, and we got the error message because we need to specify a redirect URL in the on authentication failure handler here. So we call super set default failure URL is /login question mark error. This is the default failure URL of Spring Framework. Okay, save the change and test again. Login, enter wrong password, and okay, see this time it directs me to the error page instead of the error you seen before. And you can see in the console view it prints attempt authentication and on authentication failure. And in order to display the correct error message generated by Spring Security, we should update the login page in the section that displays the error in case of the error parameter is present here, login question mark error. So here we should print the original error message by Spring Security, which is session dot Spring Security last exception and dot message. Okay, and test again. And you can see the original exception message generated by Spring Security is bad credentials here. Okay, now let me try to log in with the correct password. Okay, successful login. And let's see in the console view, you can see it prints on attempt authentication and on authentication success. That means the login success handler callback method on authentication success here were actually invoked. So far, so good. Next, we need to implement the workflow on attempt authentication. The application we check if the request is suspicious or not, and redirect the user to the login error page in case the request is likely a spam. And if the request is a normal request, process the login as normal. So in the before authentication filter here, in this filter class, we need to use an instance of customer manage the customer services. So we auto private customer services. In this project, I have the business class for customer in the customer services class here. And we let Spring Framework to inject an instance of customer services into this filter class, and then we can use customer service class in the callback method attempt authentication here. First, we need to get email from the request. We have the request object here, get parameter email. And for testing purpose, we print the email here. Email. And we then get a customer based on email. Customer equal customer service. And in this guest customer by email method, in this business class, I already implemented the guest customer by email method. It's very simple. Just delegate the call to the customer repository file by email method, and it will return an object of type customer in case a customer was found in the database with a given email. Import the entity class, and we check if customer is not null. Then we process. Else we return super attempt authentication to let Spring Framework authenticate the user normally. And in case customer is found with a given email, then we check spam score equal get Google reCAPTCHA score. I recommend you to follow my video on my YouTube channel for Google reCAPTCHA version 3. In this video, I just create a method to return a fake value. Here, just return a number, a floating number, for example 0.43, indicating that the request is likely a bot or spam. And according to Google, it recommended to check the spam score if it is less than 0.5, meaning that the request is likely a spam and we need to take action. For example, in this case, we need to we require the user to use one-time password sent to their email. So here we generate OTP and send email, and we throw an exception, throw new insufficient authentication exception. This exception class defined by Spring Security, and we just specify a message OTP here. So in the login failure handler, we can check the exception message to generate the failure redirect URL accordingly. Okay, now initially we just throwing exception to indicate that the login failed. Okay, and in the login failure handler, we need to also get the email from the request. Get parameter email. And for testing purpose, we print the email here to easily check the workflow of the code. And here, in case failed login, this authentication failure method will be invoked, so we can check the content of the exception here. If exception get message contains the word OTP, we construct a redirect URL failure redirect URL. By default, it will be the default redirect URL required by Spring Security. So this is a default failure redirect URL, and in case the exception contains the word OTP, meaning that an OTP is required. So we construct the failure redirect URL slightly different. So in the login form, we can detect and display corresponding error message. Login question mark OTP equals true, and we should send the email to the URL. So in the login form, we can display the email. Okay. Now let's update the login form, login page here. In the login page, we will be display the error message like this here. In case the OTP parameter is present in the request. So here we update, copy this section and modify, and we check if the parameter OTP is present. We display the error message. For security reason, we will send an one-time password OTP to your email, and then the value of the user email, which is the value of the parameter param.email. We need to set the email also in case not OTP error here. And the second line is kindly check your email and use the provided OTP to log in. Kindly check your email and use the provided OTP to log in. And the last line is note the OTP will expire after 5 minutes. The OTP will expire in 5 minutes. Okay, and we display the value for the email field here. th:\value. Value is the value of the parameter name email, which is sent in the URL, redirect URL here, email here. So the customer's user doesn't have to retype email. And for the placeholder for password, in case OTP is required, we display the text for the placeholder is your one-time password. So here we use Thymeleaf placeholder here, and we check for the value of the parameter param OTP is not no. Then we display the text for the placeholder is one-time password. Else we display just a password in case OTP is not required. So one-time password. That's it. Now we're ready to test the error message in case OTP is required. Suppose that the spam score returned by Google reCAPTCHA is less than the threshold 0.5 here. Okay, now let me try to make a failed login attempt. We got an error. Could not pass expression. My mistake in the login page. We need to have the closing curly brace here. Refresh. Okay, the login form here, and let me try to enter an email which doesn't exist in the database, and it will display the error message normally because as you can see, because the customer object return here is no, and this method is called super attempt authentication login. And you can see it displays the original exception message generated by Spring Security bad credentials. And you can see in the URL we send email here, and the email was set to the email field, so the customer doesn't have to retype email. Now let me enter email of a customer that exists in the database, name Java programmer. As you can see in the database, we have a customer with the email name Java programmer at gmail.com here. And let me try to enter any password login. And you can see it displays the error message here. For security reason, we will send an on-time password OTP to your email. Kindly check your email and use the provided OTP to log in. And note the OTP will expire in 5 minutes here. And you can see the text placeholder of the password field now become your one-time password, because in the URL we specify the parameter OTP equal to here. So far so good, right? Okay. Now I'm going to show you how to write code to generate the OTP. So here, if the spam score is less than 0.5, we call customer service generate one-time password for a given customer object, and let's create this method in the customer service class. Here we go. And we generate a random string to be used as the OTP. So we can use a random string class in the package net.byteBuddy.utility. Here, this byteBuddy dependency comes with Spring framework by default, so we don't have to use an external library. In case you want to use Apache Common library, feel free to use, but in this video I use random string from byteBuddy and make with a given length is 8 character. So the one-time password we have 8 characters, and for testing purpose we print the content of the OTP here. OTP. And the one-time password should be encrypted using bcrypt format, just like normal password here. So we need to use the bcrypt password encoder. Bcrypt password encoder. Password encoder here. And we encode the OTP. Encoded OTP equal to password encoder. Encode the raw password is OTP. Sorry. And then we set the OTP on-time password of the customer object. Set on-time password is the encoded OTP here. And to set the expiration time for the one-time password, we need to set the set OTP requested time here, which is the current date and time. So new date. That's it. And then we call the customer repository to save this customer object. That's it. Very simple. Generate the OTP and then update the OTP password and then the OTP requested time to the customer object. Okay, and now we are ready to test. As you can see in the database, the customer table, the customer email with email name Java programmer here. And you can see the values of the two columns, one-time password and OTP requested time, are all no here. Now let me try to log in to test if the OTP is generated or not. Enter any password. Okay, we got the error message, and now let's check. We don't see any statement for OTP. Sorry, I have not saved the before authentication. My mistake. Very sorry. Okay, try to log in again. Okay, let's see in the database. In the console view, first you see it prints attempt authentication, and you see the OTP is here, 8 characters. Here, a random string. And let's check the database for this let me modify the SQL statement so we can see the data easily. Select email, first name, last name, and one-time password, and OTP, requested time. Okay, so here we see, and we see for the customer name Java programmer, the values for one-time password here. It is encrypted in the bcrypt format, and the OTP requested time here. Perfect, right? Next, we need to write code to send an email that contains the OTP to the user's email with the content like this. First, we need to declare new dependency for the project to use Spring Boot Mail API in the project Maven form file here. Copy and paste this dependency and change the artifact ID to a Spring Boot starter mail. Here, save the change. And then we need to configure some properties required by JavaMail here in the application configuration file. Okay, mail. Host is smtp.gmail.com. I will use Gmail SMTP server as the outgoing email server, and password, username is Gmail account, and password is password port number. 587 is the port number of SMTP server of Gmail, and we need to specify a couple of additional properties for the security mail. SMTP authentication true, and start TLS enable true to indicate that the outgoing email server requires authentication with a security mechanism is start TLS. Okay, so this is a properties you need to specify to configure Spring Boot mail in order to send email. Next, we need to write code to send an email containing the generated OTP to the user email address, to the customer's email address. After the one-time password OTP has been generated here, we send an OTP email for a given customer, and the OTP. And create this method. And in order to use Spring Mail, we need to declare a reference to Java Mail Sender. Here, Mail Sender. And we tell Spring Framework to inject an instance of this class, so we use the annotation auto-while here. And then here we can use the Java Mail Sender. We create a new MyMail message because the email message we are going to send is type HTML. Mail sender dot create my message, and we need to create a new my message helper. Here, helper equal new my message helper, wrapping the message here, and we set the from field is a recipient email address here. contact at shopme.com. Name is shopme support. And sorry, this is email of the sender, not the recipient. And the email of the recipient is a customer email. Set to is a recipient email. Customer get email. We need to throw exception here. And the content of the email is here. The subject here's the one-time password OTP expire in 5 minutes. So we set a subject. Subject is here's the one-time password OTP expire in 5 minutes. This is the subject of the email. And the content of the email. Content is hello, the first name of the customer. We use HTML code in the content of the email. Hello, and then the first name of the customer. Get first name. And the second line is for security reason, you are required to use the following one-time password to log in. For security reason, you are required to use the following one-time password to log in. And the next line is the OTP, random password here, with the value of the OTP parameter here. OTP. We have the OTP in both. OTP. And the last line is note this OTP is set to expire in 5 minutes. Blank line. Note this OTP is set to expire in 5 minutes. That's it. That's for the content of the email. And we set the subject to the helper. Subject is subject and set content. Set text is content with boolean value to indicate the email is in HTML format. And then we call the method of the mail sender. Mail sender send message. So it is quite simple, right? We need to rethrow the exception here, and then we need to catch the exception in the before authentication handler here. We need to check catch here. Catch messaging exception and unsupported encoding exception. And in case of error, we throw a new exception. We throw new authentication service exception. Authentication service exception. This exception class is defined by Spring Security error while sending OTP to the email. Okay, that's it, and we need to stop and start the application. Stop and start, because we have made the change to use Spring Mail. Okay, the application is up and running without any error. Okay, and for testing purpose, we just print something after the statement that sends the email here. Email was sent. And now let me log into my Gmail to check email. Yes, and you can see my email is Java programmer here. That matches the email of the customer I used to log in here. Okay, currently I don't have any new mail. Okay, and the application is up and running. Okay, let me try to log in. My email. Login. You see, it runs slowly because it needs to send email. And you can see I got the error message here. And let's see in the console view. You see, it prints OTP and email was sent here. And let me check my email. Here I got a new email here from Shopee support. The subject is here's the one-time password OTP expire in 5 minutes. And let me check the email. And this is the email content, and you can see in the content of the email it includes the OTP here. The OTP is exactly the OTP generated by the application here. Okay, so that's how to write code to send the email that contains the OTP to the user. Next, I'm going to show you how to write code to intervene the authentication process of Spring Security to perform OTP login in case if the application decides that OTP is required. So we need to update the customer object that represents the customer in the application to implement a method that check if OTP is required based on the fields one-time password and OTP requested time. So we implement a new method here. Public boolean is OTP required. And we define the expiration time for OTP is 5 minutes. So we declare a constant here. Long OTP valid duration equal to 5 minutes multiplied by 60 seconds and multiplied by 1000 milliseconds per second here. So you see for 5 minutes. And in this method is the OTP required. We check if this one-time password is no, then we return false. And we get the time of the OTP requested in milliseconds. Long OTP requested time in millisecond equal to this OTP requested time. Get time here. The get time method returns the time in milliseconds. And here we check if OTP requested time in millisecond plus OTP valid duration time. Here, if less than the current time, which is system current time in minutes here. Then we return false. This means that OTP expires, and otherwise return true to indicate that OTP login is required. So this is a check for the validation expiration of the OTP one-time password. And then we need to update the customer user details class that represents an authenticated user. Here you see in the customer user details service here, this load user by username method will be called by Spring Security to perform login check, and it returns a new customer user details object grabbing an instance of the customer object. And here in the get password method, here we check if customer is OTP required, then we return the password is the OTP password, get one-time password, else we return the normal password. And then in the before authentication filter, here we check if spam score less than 0.5, then we also check if customer is OTP required equal true, then we don't execute the code to generate one-time password. Instead, we return the call to super attempt authentication to let Spring Security to perform authentication. And upon login check it, we call this method get password, and here we return the one-time password instead of the normal password in case OTP is required. That's it. Save all the changes and we are ready to test login using OTP. Okay, my email, delete email here, login. It will send an email containing OTP to my email. Here, I got new email. Here's your one-time password, and this is a random OTP, and I can use this to log in. And in the console view, you can see it prints the OTP here. And let's see in the database. Refresh this select statement, and you can see the OTP requested time is set to this time, and one-time password has the value. And now let me use the OTP password here to log in. Copy and paste into the one-time password field here and click login. You see, I have logged in successfully using one-time password. Perfect, right? So that's how to intervene the authentication process to perform OTP login when required. So we need to implement this method to check is OTP login required, and then in the customer user details class here in the get password method, which will be called by Spring Security to get the password of the user, we return the one-time password instead of the normal password. Next, I will show you how to write code to clear the OTP upon successful login using OTP. As you can see, I have logged in successfully using OTP password here, but in the database here in the database you can see the one-time password of this user is still there. Also the OTP requested time, and we should clear the value of these two columns upon successful login using OTP. So in the project, we need to update the login success handler here on the authentication success method here will be invoked by Spring Security upon successful login. So here from the authentication object that represents an authenticated user, we can get the customer user details object. User details equal to authentication get principal, and we cast the returned object to an object of type customer user details here, and then we can get the customer object from the user details class here. Get customer. If not, we should implement getter method. Sorry, customer user details here. We write a getter method to return a customer object. Get customer, because this customer user detail object wraps an instance of customer object here, as you can see, customer here. Okay, so here we get the customer object from the customer user details object here, and then we can check if customer is OTP required. Then we clear the OTP from this customer. We need to have to use the customer service C class, so we need to declare a reference to customer service C class here. Customer service, and we call the method customer service clear OTP for a given customer, and we create this clear OTP method in the customer service class. Here we just set one-time password to null, and set OTP requested time to null. OTP requested time to null, and then we call customer repository here to update the customer object customer. And for testing purpose, we print a statement here, cleared OTP. So that's it, and we are ready to test this workflow, clearing the OTP upon successful login using OTP. Save all the changes, and we are ready to test again. So the OTP requested time is 14:05 here, and now the time is 14:13 here. That means the OTP already expired. Okay, now let me try to log in again. Log in, enter email, and it will request one-time password. Yeah, see. Now let me check email. Okay, I got new email, and this is a new OTP. Yeah, and let's check the database, and you see the time of OTP is now 14:15 here. Okay, and now I use this OTP. So copy and paste here. Login. Successful login, you see. And then now let's see in the console view, you can see it prints cleared OTP here. Now let's verify the database, and you can see the values of one-time password and OTP requested time have been removed from the database for this customer non-Java programmer here. Perfect, right? Next, I'm going to show you how to write code to display the error message in case the customer, the user enter wrong password in the login form using OTP login. So we need to update the login failure handler here. We need to have a reference to the customer service class to retrieve an customer object. Customer service is customer service. So upon failed login, this method on authentication failure will be invoked by Spring Security, and we check if the exception message doesn't contain the OTP else here. So we need to get a customer object, customer equal customer service, get customer by email here. And we check if customer object is not null and if is OTP is required. Then we use the direct URL like this to indicate that the customer has failed to log in using OTP, and in the login form it will display the error message related to OTP login. That's it, very simple. And now let's test the failed login case. Okay, so here in the database you see for this customer, no values for on-time password and OTP requested time. Now let me try to log in. Log in here, enter email here. Okay, and I should get an email. Yeah, I got a new mail, and this time this is the OTP one-time password for this time, but somehow I enter it incorrectly. Here it should display the same error message. Login, and you can see it displays the same error message, one-time password, and let me use this one-time password provided in the email. Copy and paste. Login. You see, I have logged in successfully here. So that's how to update the code in case the customer fails to log in using OTP. The application should still display the OTP error message. Now let's make a final test in case OTP login is not required. So in this method, we return a value greater than 0.5. In practice, we should replace this code with the return score from the actual Google API result. So here I return 0.63 here, which is greater than 0.5. So that means OTP is not required and normal login will be applied. And in the database, you see no values for one-time password and OTP requested time. Now let me log in normally with no OTP. Login is required using my normal password. You see, I have logged in successfully, and in the console view, you can see it prints only attempt authentication and on authentication success because no OTP is required. I don't get any new email, and in the database, no information updated here. Okay, so that's perfect, right? Awesome, right? So far you have learned how to tighten security, improve security of an existing Spring Boot application by implementing OTP one-time password email feature. I hope you will find this video helpful. Please help me to grow this channel by subscribing and then like, comment and share this video. Thanks for watching.